Hello, and welcome to the final session of Federalism on Trial, Lessons from COVID-19 Conference. I'm Scott Paul. I serve as Interim Director and Executive Director here at the Center for Constitutional Studies at Utah Valley University in Orem, Utah. As we begin this session, we must express deep gratitude to the Utah State Legislature and especially to the legislature's Utah Federalism Commission for their enduring commitment to functional federalism and for their support of our Federalism Index project. We also thank UVU Provost Dr. Wayne Vaught and UVU President Dr. Astrid Jimenez for their support of the center. And I must make one final acknowledgement as we near the end of this conference. Before this session, you were treated to the recording of an interview with Dr. Rodney Smith. Sadly, this July, our dear friend and director, Dr. Rod Smith, passed away following an 8-year battle with cancer. Rod was a gifted leader and a brilliant scholar who exuded genuine affection for everyone he met. We miss him very much. I'm confident he would have been pleased with the proceedings these last 2 days. I am very excited to serve as moderator for this session because we have the good fortune of hearing from 3 excellent scholars and presenters, and I'll share a little bit about them before they speak. First, we will hear from Professor Ernest Young. Professor Young teaches constitutional law, federal courts, and foreign relations law. He is one of the nation's leading authorities on constitutional law of federalism, having written extensively on the Rehnquist Court's Federalist Revival and the difficulties confronting courts as they seek to draw lines between national and state authority. He is also an active commentator on foreign relations law, where he focuses on the interaction between domestic and supranational courts and the application of international law by domestic courts. Professor Young also writes on constitutional interpretation and constitutional theory. Elected to the American Law Institute in 2006, Professor Young is an active participant in both public and private litigations in his areas of interest. He has been the principal author of amicus briefs on behalf of leading constitutional scholars in several recent Supreme Court cases. And with that, Professor Young, the time is now yours.
Okay, well, thank you. I want to start by thanking Scott Paul, the Center for Constitutional Studies, and Utah Valley University for including me in this conference. It seems fitting in what may be the closing days of the Trump administration to begin with a tweet, not from the president himself, but from Molly Jong-Fast, who I gather is some sort of Twitter pundit. Assessing the state of the Republic's response to the coronavirus pandemic, Ms. Jong-Fast was incredulous. So the states are basically governing themselves because our president doesn't know how to president at all? One can understand why Mrs. Jong-Fast was so surprised. When Herbert Wechsler wrote about American federalism in the 1950s, he could still assert with some plausibility that there was a general presumption that most problems would be handled by the states. That presumption was fading fast even then, however, and by the late 20th century, I think it's fair to say, had you asked the figurative person in the street whether they would expect the national government or the states to take the lead in responding to a national emergency affecting the whole country, they would surely have thought that the national government was the obvious choice. Certainly, 21st century Americans tend to consume national news, follow national politics, study national law, and the chattering class is profoundly a national class. The failure of the national government to take point on a problem of national extent is widely perceived as exactly that, a failure. In my remarks, I want to consider the possibility that this failure, that is a response to the pandemic, in which the most salient decisions, those about lockdowns and reopening, are left to state and local government, may actually be the right way to president or to Congress in this particular kind of emergency and under the conditions confronting our nation at the present moment. Let me start with a couple of very important caveats. First, it is plainly just too early to tell whether this decentralized response will turn out to have been good or correct in terms of public health or maintaining a viable economy. The situation remains fluid. The medical consensus seems to change almost daily on important aspects of the virus and effective responses to it. The economic jury is also still out. And in any event, defining good outcomes depends not only on uncertainties about facts, but also incredibly difficult moral trade-offs. think of my talk as a thought experiment concerning whether, in light of all these uncertainties, a decentralized response to the pandemic is a plausible one. Second, we have to be careful about conflating judgments about which institutions should decide things with our potentially idealized expectations about what decisions those institutions will reach. It's odd to hear people who plainly wouldn't trust President Trump to watch their cat for 2 hours bewail his failure to formulate and impose a national pandemic policy. And it's easy to believe in one policy to rule them all when you assume that it will be your favorite policy. Federalism is in many ways an institutional means of hedging one's bets when you don't know if a centralized power will do the right thing. I will do my best to remain agnostic about the appropriate policy response as a matter of substance and to keep my eye on the ball of which set of institutions should make that call. I want to make 3 sets of observations about decentralization in the pandemic. The first is that a decentralized response really is rather surprising, even from the standpoint of a constitutional commitment to federalism. That's because ample legal authority existed for a much more centralized approach. The fact is that under the legal structures of our federalism, we had a choice to make about how to respond to the pandemic. The second observation is that plausible reasons can be offered for the basic pattern that our response has taken so far. Under that pattern, the federal government has taken the lead on some things: economic relief and stimulus, encouraging vaccine development, and mobilizing resources for particularly hard-hit places, but left the most immediately salient aspects, lockdown orders and decisions about reopening, to state and local governments. Keeping in mind that we won't know what actually worked and what didn't for years, I think that pattern is very plausible. And third, I want to point out that decentralization has in fact gone even further, that we have in fact devolved many of the crucial decisions to private institutions and individuals. The pandemic has taken Heather Gerken's notion of federalism all the way down even further. So let's start with what our federal structure might have allowed. When President Trump claimed to have the ultimate authority to decide whether to override state lockdown orders, that claim was met with derision. The New York Times fact checkers, after speaking with various law professors, rated the claim as false. But have they read the Public Health Act? 42 USC section 264A provides that the Surgeon General, who serves at the pleasure of the president, is authorized to make and enforce such regulations as in his judgment are necessary to prevent the introduction, transmission, or spread of communicable diseases from foreign countries into the states or possessions, or from one state or possession into any other state or possession. That's pretty broad. Now, maybe the Times fact checkers thought that this doesn't say anything about overriding public health orders issued by the states. But if they thought that, they haven't read many preemption cases. In those cases, a more limited federal regulation often trumps more rigorous state regulations. That happens all the time. So there are any number of relevant delegations of authority to executive officers that the president might draw upon to take control over response to the pandemic. One might try to read these narrowly. I would favor trying to read them narrowly, but courts generally do not read such things narrowly. And of course, presidents have long asserted emergency powers over and beyond those powers delegated in statutes to deal with situations precisely like this. Now, I don't mean to be heard as complaining about any of this. I think President Trump, either consciously or by dumb luck, I don't much care which, grasped a fundamental truth about American federalism. The reservoirs of national power run deep. And there are very, very few things that a government might really want to do or to address for which ultimate power to address them cannot be found in the national government. But that doesn't mean the national government should address these things rather than leave the states to take the lead. American federalism is largely a matter of present political choice. Outside of the basic framework, it isn't locked into any particular configuration by the Constitution. So it makes sense to ask, given this choice, how should a federal republic respond to a pandemic? In answering that question, let me start with what we left to the states and localities, and then circle back to what the national government hung on to. State and local authorities have largely retained control over lockdown orders, by which I also mean things like closing public schools, travel restrictions within the country, and social distancing and mask requirements short of a total lockdown. I think that is a highly plausible claim for several reasons. The first is pervasive uncertainty. Decentralization is often a good response when you're not sure what to do. If I may channel Donald Rumsfeld for a moment, this pandemic presents policymakers with at least 3 sets of known unknowns. The first is uncertainty about the health impacts themselves and how the virus works, how it's transmitted, how fatal it's going to be, that sort of thing. The second is uncertainty about trade-offs. So these include both health trade-offs, for instance, the benefits of decreased virus spread versus costs of less people going to the doctor and catching cancers early, or trade-offs of health and other values, disrupting children's education, throwing people out of work, undermining social cohesion. We're starting to see some efforts at quantifying some of these trade-offs, but those efforts are in their infancy, and some of these values probably can't be quantified. And then finally, there's uncertainty about how to weigh the trade-offs. How many lost jobs is equivalent to one life, for instance? It's important to recognize that these questions are not simply questions of science. There is no obvious answer as to how to weigh, for example, the likelihood of a somewhat greater spread of the virus against the impact of keeping large numbers of first graders out of school. When you're uncertain about what to do, it makes sense to try different responses in different jurisdictions. That's basically what we've done. We also need to consider variations in conditions. So even if we know what the right policy response is, that doesn't mean it will be right for every place. The coronavirus is very different in Abilene, Texas, where I'm from, than it is in New York City. Several kinds of variation exist. One has to do with physical conditions. What's the climate? What's the density of population? What's the medical infrastructure like? Second group has to deal with economic conditions. Which industries are the key industries in a given place and which ones are hardest hit? How able is the local workforce to work from home? What's the presence of essential industries like food packing or distribution? And then third, there's variation in political conditions. How much willingness is there to comply with lockdown orders? What's the public thinking on how balance between physical health, mental health, and economic health should be struck? It should be obvious that what is necessary and what is feasible will vary across different parts of the country. Most of our big national regulatory schemes acknowledge this by having states take the lead on many implementation aspects. Even where we've done away with federalism by federalizing, say, environmental law, we've immediately felt the need to reinvent it by building it into the structure of the national regulatory scheme. Another reason to decentralize is civil liberties concerns. So I think even ardent fans of the present mix of pandemic policies can agree that they raise a largely unprecedented level of concern about civil liberties. Think of just the radical restrictions on freedom of movement. We also have public officials breaking up religious services and imposing criminal sanctions on worship. We have police breaking up protests. In downtown Raleigh, not far from where I live, the police broke up a local protest outside the State House and said that protest is not an essential activity under the governor's order. And there's serious concerns about whether lockdown measures are applied even-handedly or favor preferred groups. So honestly, if you told me a year ago that I'd see people threatened with criminal sanctions for going to church in this country, I'd have laughed. Now, none of that is to say that these measures can't be defended as constitutional. I think some of them probably not. The point is, if they are constitutional, then we've handed an awful lot of power to the government to control our exercise of some pretty basic rights. I prefer my Leviathan smaller rather than larger. So I think that it's good that these powers are wielded by state governments. It's easier to hold them accountable when they go too far. One can always vote with your feet and choose a different jurisdiction that's taken a different approach. And it leaves the national government able to act in its historic role of policing state infringements of constitutional rights. The last set of considerations really just heightens the others, and that has to do with polarization and mistrust. So Americans are both divided among ourselves and mistrustful of government institutions. This bears on pandemic response in a variety of ways. One is it affects our ability to get good information. It's hard enough when you can't tell, for instance, whether an increase in cases of the virus means the virus is getting worse or the testing's getting a lot better. But when everything is spun by a polarized and politicized media in the first place, it's even harder to know what to think or how to make policy. And how scared you are tracks pretty much onto party right now. And so being scared, that is supporting lockdown measures, has become a way to signal your affiliation. And so the partisan divide affects the pandemic response in what I think is a very dangerous way. And then finally, polarization affects our ability to implement policy responses by making it harder and sometimes impossible to legislate. If we had depended on Congress to respond to this problem, then the inability of Congress to pass basic legislation would have become a major impediment. So couple this with a long-term decline in public trust in government institutions, but especially national government institutions. And a national response becomes quite difficult indeed. So decentralization may help with that for several reasons. One is that the states are more likely to have solid partisan majorities rather than the 50-50 division we see at the national level. And so it's easier for them to act. A state-by-state decentralized response may actually be more nimble than a federal one in this particular political environment. And it's more likely that the actions they take will satisfy a larger majority of their citizens and be more likely to get compliance. Second, state and local institutions tend to do better in the public trust surveys. And so it may be easier for them to get public buy-in that's critical to making these measures work. And then finally, I think it's fair to say that the partisan battle lines are just a little bit less rigid in states and localities. I'm not quite sure why that's true or the extent to which it's true, but one reason may be that so much partisan anger is focused on national politics, that we don't tend to think of state and local politics in quite the same way. The other reason may be that what's at stake in local politics, the quality of the schools, for instance, is just so much more a bread and butter question that we can't afford to be partisan hacks on those questions. Finally, I want to shift just very briefly to what the national government has taken the lead on. These areas also make sense in terms of traditional thinking about federalism. So economic relief and stimulus is probably the most salient thing that they've done. They've spent literally trillions of dollars in order to cushion the economic impact of this crisis. And our system of fiscal federalism makes that a lot easier for the federal government to do. Most states have balanced budget requirements, right? And most states have limits, therefore, on their ability to borrow and spend more than they're taking in. The federal government has always been better at counter-cyclical spending because it doesn't have any such requirement. And that advantage is coming through in spades right now. Second, things like vaccine research, it makes sense to centralize in many instances. And a key aspect of encouraging vaccine research, which is suppressing various regulatory roadblocks that might otherwise impede it, can only be done by the national government because those requirements that are being suspended are national requirements. And then finally, I think it makes sense for the federal government to provide spot relief, to direct resources to where they're needed most when there are particular flare-ups. That's very similar to how we approach disaster relief, for instance, and one could argue that's how we approach criminal law enforcement. So finally, I want to briefly make a further observation about how devolution has gone even further. My friend Heather Gerken has argued for federalism all the way down, by which she means not just devolution to states, but to local actors, juries, and similar smaller institutions. I would submit that we have, in part by default, devolved critical authority further still to a host of private actors. So some of those actors are simply individuals. The evidence suggests that social distancing started and made a dent in the virus spread before lockdown orders came into force. And by the same token, it looks like lockdown fatigue may undermine the effect of lockdown orders, even if they remain in place. So the decisions by private actors are still mattering a great deal. And then there are private decisions by larger institutions, corporate employers, universities, airlines, movie theaters, and distributors, professional and collegiate sports leagues. The policy decisions that most affect my life are made by Duke University, which, in case you didn't know, is basically a very large hospital with a little university attached to it. We've been considerably more restrictive than the state of North Carolina in our response to the virus. We've got better COVID numbers, but we've made the trade-offs quite differently from the way the rest of the jurisdiction has. Is this a good thing that we've devolved these decisions to private actors? Only time will tell, I think. But it does highlight that capitalism, as well as federalism, is an ideological force for decentralization in our political structure. And certainly the further divvying up of public power into private as well as public hands allows us more baskets into which we can place our eggs. In times of profound uncertainty, I think that's probably a good thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Young. You've given us a lot to consider, and I look forward to delving into your remarks at the end of the session with our question and answer. We will next hear from Professor Gary Gerstle, who arrived in Cambridge in 2014 after 3 decades in the United States. That would be Cambridge, England. He's coming up to us today, however, from Cambridge, Massachusetts. He is currently the Paul Mellon Professor of American History and Fellow of Sidney, Sussex College. He is a social and political historian of the 20th century with substantial interests in the late 18th and 19th centuries. Professor Gerstle has received many fellowships and has lectured throughout North America and Europe and in Brazil, Israel, Mexico, Japan, South Africa, and Korea. He was elected to the Society of American Historians in 2006 and is named a distinguished lecturer of the Organization of American Historians in 2007. He's testified before the U.S. Congress on immigration matters and served as an advisor and on-screen commentator for the 2013 public broadcast service documentary, Latino Americans. And with that, Professor Gerstle, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Scott, and thank you to the Center for Constitutional Studies and to Utah Valley University for this invitation. My talk is going to be quite different from Professor Young's. I am a historian, and I want to use my time to give you a thumbnail overview of the history of federalism in American governance. I will do this in 15 minutes. It will either be successful or partially successful, but I think it's worthwhile. And I will end up in the current moment, but I think the historical perspective will be valuable. For those who want to find out more about my thinking in this area, let me just mention my most recent book, Liberty and Coercion, The Paradox of American Government from the Founding to the Present, published by Princeton University Press in 2015 and a paperback in 2017. There are two theories of governance embedded in the Constitution. One is very familiar, and that is the notion that government power ought to be limited and it ought to be fragmented. This theory of governance is associated with the central government, whose powers were limited to those enumerated in the Constitution, and the framers took care to divide powers of the central government into three branches, the famous checks and balances. There was another theory that came to be interpreted as being embedded in the Constitution, however, and that is a doctrine whose name is not familiar to most people, and it wasn't familiar to me until about 10 years ago. And that is the so-called police power. This is the legal scholars call this the residual power of government, vested in the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, the last of the Bill of Rights, which said whatever power is not explicitly granted to the central government remain with the states. Now, residual suggests that it doesn't really matter that much. Usually when we think of residual things, they're not that important. But these were actually extraordinarily important because of the limited nature of powers given to the central government. The powers that resided with the states remained very capacious. And the doctrine of police power was understood in the 19th century as being far more capacious than modern notion of policing. When we think of modern notion of policing, we think of law and order. And law and order was part of the police power, but it also involved the right and duty of states to look after the good and welfare of their constituents. This power was vested in the state legislature. It was derived from the 18th century powers of the British sovereign. It was a broad and versatile charter of authority that empowered state governments to intervene quite extensively in the economy, in politics, in culture, and morality. And that was one big reason when Americans in the 19th century had encounters with their state, except in times of war. It was almost entirely encounters with state or local governments, and local governments were then under the control of the states. Now, the Civil War is thought to have changed all that. Obviously, dramatic growth in the power of the central state. And because the North won and the South lost, the rebellious secessionist states were brought to heel. They were stripped of what they regarded as one of their fundamental rights, which was to treat human beings as property. They were stripped of that property without compensation. So this was a dramatic change and a dramatic imposition of central government power on the states. But what we might call a revolution in government power was followed by a counter-revolution. A counter-revolution which witnessed the restoration of many antebellum powers of states to their post-bellum condition. And one sign of this is that states had not been bound by the Bill of Rights. And by the late 19th century, they were no longer bound by the Bill of Rights. This is something that most Americans don't understand. It's something that most historians, I would say, don't understand. It's kind of an ignored part of American history, but very significant. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. And that was interpreted by 19th century jurists literally as Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. It said nothing what state legislatures couldn't do in terms of abridging freedom of speech. Now, some state legislatures or state constitutional conventions chose to bind themselves by their own Bill of Rights, but they were not required to. And if you think as one of the most fundamental documents protecting individual rights not being imposed on the states for much of American history, it really speaks to the extraordinary power that states retained within themselves. Now, this restoration of state power and police power had a repressive side, manifest most clearly in segregation and what was called the system of Jim Crow, in which Southern states had the authority to deny Blacks the rights given to white citizens. And this was a regime of political rule that was deemed constitutionally legitimate from the 1890s to the 1950s. But this restoration of state rights also had a progressive side, manifest in states using their powers to regulate capitalism, the market, and to do things like respond to pandemics and other issues of concern to their constituents. This progressive side of state activity is best understood in the famous phrase of the early 20th century and early 20th century Supreme Court jurist Louis Brandeis, who called the states laboratories of democracy. Places where policies would be tried out, policies most suited to the people living in that area, with the understanding that those which succeeded might be modeled and copied by other states and adopted more generally. The message I want to give to you is that states entered the 20th century in America as remarkably, and I would say perhaps unexpectedly, strong institutions. Federalism was very alive and well. And three major factors changed all that. The first was the Great Depression, still the longest depression in American history, that lasted from 1929 to 1941. The second was the involvement in America in what we might call a permanent war. When America went to war in 1941 against the Axis powers, did not really end in 1945. It ended in 1989 when the Cold War finally ended. So for almost 50 years, the United States was on a permanent or semi-permanent war footing. And the third issue was the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1960s. Now, a word about how each of these events made a big difference. The Great Depression, the perception was capitalism had failed, that individual states were not capable of restoring health to markets, that these were national issues that could not be done on a state level. And so the reform project pioneered by Franklin Roosevelt and the Democrats was to amass sufficient power in the central government so as to be able to regulate capitalism, restore markets, and also provide for the first time a federal safety net for individual citizens. The permanent war of 1941 to 1989 did two things. First, when America's at war, much more power is concentrated in the executive, one branch of the central government. And that was the case during this time. These were the years of the so-called imperial presidency. And the other thing is that wars are very expensive and they require taxation. And it's in this time that the federal government finally becomes the rich cousin in the family of American governments. Until that time, the states had been the wealthy cousin, so to speak. But the revenue that the central government begins to pull in the 1940s and beyond is beyond that which the states, either individually or collectively, are able to amass. And the central government is able to use that power to conscript the states to do what it wants to do. So, and then the civil rights revolution of the 1960s, and the decision and the conviction on the part of the Warren Court that Jim Crow, segregation, inequality for blacks and whites could no longer be allowed to stand. And so this is a moment when the states are incorporated under the Bill of Rights, put under the mandate of the Bill of Rights, which is a federal Bill of Rights, put fully under the federal Constitution. And as a result of these three events, the states are much, much diminished in their autonomy and power. The Republican Party begins to think in the 1970s and 80s that it is not happy with this outcome. There was a deep sentiment in the Republican Party that the big centralized state, violated the Constitution. Ronald Reagan said that it put the US on the road to communism, or an equally nasty form of collectivism. A prime Republican Party operative of the 1990s by the name of Grover Norquist put it best. He said he wanted to shrink the size of the central state until we, meaning Republicans, could drown it in a bathtub. Once you hear that line, you can never forget it. And once I heard the line, I've never been able to forget it. But the Republican Party can't actually dismantle the entire central state erected since the 1930s. It was too large. It did too many things that were too popular. But the Republican Party was able to stymie from the 1990s on and then paralyze the state, a phenomenon that became most evident in the Obama years, and especially from 2010 to 2016, when hardly a major piece of legislation was passed by America's premier legislative body. And here I come upon the polarization that the previous speaker referred to. And it is at this moment that states, as much by necessity as by desire, begin to think about recovering lost powers. And when they become active on a variety of fronts, raising the minimum wage, having their own climate policy, having in some cases something I would never thought I would see, their own immigration policy, policies on same-sex marriage, their own policies to ban abortions, their policies on marijuana, whether to allow it or not. All these initiatives are occurring at the state level. And then when Trump is elected, he begins to hollow out what's left of what he called the deep regulatory centralized state. This is the moment when the pandemic hits. And I personally found the scenes of ineptitude at the federal level stunning. My portrait of them is not nearly as optimistic a reading as Professor Young, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that during the Q&A. Trump refused to use the full scope of his emergency powers. I think because he did that because he wanted to deny that the pandemic was really happening. And he thought if the federal government could step aside, maybe its impact would not, or the consequences of its impact would not fall at his door. States are encouraged, individual citizens are encouraged to take things into their own hand. And these are the circumstances in which the new federalism, I think, comes into its own. The governors are the heroes and the villains. They are collaborating with each other, sometimes yelling at each other, testing their powers, taking stances that, in my mind, were unimaginable 15 years before. I observe that New York State has announced that when the federal government develops its vaccines, New York State has got to hire its own panel of experts to make sure that these vaccines are well developed and not corrupted by corruption at the center of the federal government. I find this a stunning development. The concentration of scientific expertise at the center of American government had been what I thought was one of the great achievements of American government, and now that has been called into question. How far will this new federalism go? It's hard to say. There are limits. There are so many states. It's hard for them to collaborate with each other. They face the requirements, as Professor Young noted, of balanced budgets, which are going to hit hard in the coming year. But if Congress continues to be paralyzed, and if the president continues to be reluctant a new president or an old president to take leadership, then the United States will have no choice but to continue down this path. So while I'm less hopeful about the new federalism, I think it's a phenomenon whose significance is going to endure and continue to shape American life. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Gerstle. I appreciate your remarks. And again, you've given us given us a lot to cover in our question and answer at the end. We do have one final speaker on this panel. That's Professor Troy Smith. Professor Smith is at Brigham Young University, Hawaii, where he is a professor of political science. He's also a fellow at the Center for the Study of Federalism, where he is the editor of the online version of Federalism in America, an encyclopedia. His primary interest is in states lobbying Congress and the philosophy and history of federalism. His academic work has appeared in Publius, the Journal of Federalism, Congress and the Presidency, the Review of Politics, and others. Professor Smith, the time is now yours.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you to the Center for Constitutional Studies and all the people who work there who've made this conference possible. Also, thank you to the Utah Valley University and the Utah State Federalism Commission for supporting this. It's a pleasure to be a part of this conference, and it's been interesting to see the various perspectives taken on federalism and COVID-19. One of the themes that has been consistent through the panels is the polarization that dominates America today and shapes the policy responses and the lack of policy responses. And so I thought I would talk a little bit about that polarization and some of its sources and some of the deep-seated history that is driving the two different perspectives. I want to begin by talking about the bargain of federalism that has dominated the system for so long. And I'm going to share some slides. So it was just recently that a federalism scholar noted 3 elements of modern American federalism. The first is bipartisan support for a large national government. The second is federal intergovernmental grants that induce cooperation. And the third is deference to the executive, particularly administrative agencies. And after noting all 3 of these, Ben Merriman also noted that all 3 are constitutionally and politically tenuous and fragile, meaning that their support in the Constitution is not particularly solid and the political support for them is falling apart. For example, the first one, the bipartisan support for a large national government, which dominated much of the late 20th century, has begun to fall apart. The Tea Party was a response to opposition to that. And the Trump campaign and administration has also challenged certain aspects of that. The federal intergovernmental grant system is very expensive, and federal debts are drawing into question the sustainability of those grants. And the Supreme Court, as it's taken a bit of a conservative turn, is indicating that it will challenge the deference to the executive, particularly the Chevron doctrine, and deference to the administrative agencies. So we see this federalism bargain beginning to break down. There are a number of proposals for what should replace it, but none clearly dominate in the conversation today. Let me look at just some possible causes of polarization, and then I want to focus on the last one. A lot of people say the polarization is a result of gerrymandering, but there's broad agreement by those who study polarization and gerrymandering that this is not the cause. If it were, it would be hard to explain the polarization in the United States Senate, where there is no gerrymandering. Another one is the internet. The internet is challenging elites and establishing forms, ways of doing things. Some have compared this to the invention of the Gutenberg press, which ultimately led to the Protestant Reformation and then 30 or 80 years of war, depending on how you count them. The internet similarly has released new and challenging ways of challenging elites and mobilizing groups together. The centralization of power has been seen as a cause of polarization, in part because it no longer allows diversity and variety, but creates one standard for everyone. Also, more is at stake when the federal government has the power. And so different groups must be active to protect their interest. Sometimes that includes deciding which way the political winds are going to blow rather than what they actually favor. Another is the decline of civic education. The United States currently spends $54 per student on the STEM fields, but it only spends 5 cents per student on civics education. And 15% of American students don't get any civics education at all. A failure to understand our political system, how it works, the limits on power, has led to some pretty strange theories about what our government can and should not do. It's definitely led to a misunderstanding of federalism. Another possible cause is the political party reforms of the 1960s and 1970s. These shifted the political party system from a state-centered system that gave states who are concerned with a lot of the practical policies and how it's going to actually work for their citizens, shifted from this party system from a state-centered system to a candidate-centered system, and that has shifted to a national party control system. This has allowed for an emphasis on more polarization rather than on practical solutions to the problems that are faced. Yuval Levin has also pointed out that this has led to politicians using institutions as platforms to perform rather than as institutions to form deliberation and good policy. And also with those political party reforms have come primary elections, which have allowed extreme political candidates to be elected rather than the more moderate ones that the parties would generally choose to ensure winning the election. An example of this is in Utah not too long ago when the moderate Senator Bennett was rejected by the Republican Party. Another problem is campaign finance reform. And I'll just mention one of these aspects of how it's affected it. In the past, before campaign finance reform, a number of state and local officials candidates would travel with the national party candidates to different events. In their travels, they would get to know each other. They would get to share ideas and concerns and develop relationships that would help them work out problems if they both got elected. Campaign finance reform has prohibited those sorts of collaborative engagements, even just traveling to different events. A third is the rise of Republican conservative supporting organizations. The Democratic progressive organizations have been very active for quite a long time, financially supporting different institutions and funds to encourage the advocacy and promotion of their ideas. The Republicans have been quite slow at this. In the 1950s, Time magazine asked if conservatism is dead because the conservatives didn't have much going for them in a scholarly way. That's changed with the Charles Koch Foundation, the Federalist Society. Conservative and Republican groups have developed a scholarly agenda to support ideas favoring their positions. And there's greater now competition between these different perspectives. One theme that has been getting a fair amount of attention is inequality, both in wealth and across the states. The claim is that differences and factions overwhelm individuals' public life. If we can overcome these with the same protections, benefits, and services to all Americans, then fellow feeling and neighborliness could be combined with a powerful centralized government and expertise to attack America's most pressing problems. This is a favored explanation of the American Political Science Association. Is this a problem? Yes, but is it the problem? And is solving it the solution? I think not. Inequality across the states has long existed in the United States without causing this level of polarization. What makes it different now? Would requiring the deficient states to change their policies and more closely resemble progressive states actually reduce conflict or increase it? And this actually reminds me of the 1950s American Political Science Association's call to consolidate the parties, to condense them and make them more national. And we saw what the consequence of that was. So these are all possible causes of polarization, but I think a bigger one is the, let's see if I can go back, is two constitutions. And this is developed by Charles Kessler and Christopher Caldwell, among others, and argued that the Democrats and Republicans' understanding of the US Constitution varies differently. It's very, very different. They're so different as to be two very different constitutions. The Republican conservative interpretation claims to be a faithful representation of the founders' understanding. It rests on a theory of natural rights, that rights belong to individuals who are naturally equal. It says the purpose of government is to secure those rights, to foster liberty based on equality of law. It says political powers are dispersed and limited, and federalism is an essential means of accomplishing that. The democratic progressive interpretation is based on a belief that humans and human society are perfectible by expert management, requires strong centralized government to overcome and displace entrenched interest. And it favors decisions by the experts, bureaucrats, and the judiciary. Now, I want to build on this idea and develop it a little bit more because I think these two constitutions are really a fundamental part of understanding the polarization in America. Here's a little bit of a historical timeline. The top side of the timeline represents what I'm calling Wilsonian, from Woodrow Wilson, who was really one of the basic advocates of this centralized bureaucratic way of understanding government administration. And the bottom line is the Madisonian, which is a democratic administration. Now, the Madisonian idea really begins with the Hebrew Renaissance of the 16th and 17th century that went back to the Israeli Republic and understood that covenants could be the basis of society. And federalism comes from the Latin term feudus, which means treaty, pact, or covenant. And with this Hebrew Renaissance came groups that were religiously founded called covenant societies, and political societies based on covenants were called federal societies. The idea was developed by Heinrich Bullinger, Althusius, and the Pilgrims who traveled on the Mayflower and established the Mayflower Compact in 1620 were from that tradition of covenant. And they created government based on covenants. And that shaped, and all of the other major groups that came to America for the next 100 years were basically from that covenant tradition. And Americans experimented with that federal form of government for the next 170 years. The Constitution in many ways was a culmination of the Constitution, of that covenant tradition. The Massachusetts Constitution that was written by John Adams specifically mentions that it is a covenant between the people. Tocqueville picked up on this idea and talked about democratic administration in the United States. And then it was largely forgotten and kind of, put in the background for many years. In the 20th century, we get a bunch of new philosophies that come along. And these are different theories and philosophies, but they have a lot of overlap. Systems theory, public choice, polycentricity, and complexity theory. All of these are scientific theories and understandings that can be understood within the democratic administration tradition of how governance can work. On the upper line, Martin Luther, who was a Protestant, right, but he was very hierarchical in the way he saw it should be done. Jean Baudin developed the idea of sovereignty. That idea of sovereignty was adopted by the treaties of Westphalia, which was very centralized power and authority. Thomas Hobbes developed that as well. The Jacobin French Revolution comes from that centralized idea. You have you have European emigres that come to America in 1856 and start introducing this idea. Woodrow Wilson, who studied in Europe, brings it back to America and really begins to develop it, and it begins to take off. By the 1960s, Martha Derthik said that federalism thresholds crossed and fell. Judicial, congressional, and regulatory commands flood the land, constraining virtually every state and local act. You had a diminishment of the democratic way of thinking about governance towards a more centralized authority. Today, we have multiple federalisms. We have dual federalism, cooperative federalism, picket fence federalism, coercive federalism, and what one group of scholars called igneous federalism, that is, it's all layered together. And so you get all of these, but no clear oriented theory explaining how federalism works and guiding government actions. Let me take this a little bit further. Under the Wilsonian federalism or managerial decentralization, the idea is that individuals don't know their own best interest. It's based on a tragedy of the commons. That is, individuals pursue their self-interest, and to the extent that everybody doing that will destroy common goods. And the idea is then that you need government to prevent that from happening. This is the founding myth of political science. Sir Matt Ridley has argued that every time an actual tragedy of commons is found, its cause is actually rooted in government. In the Madisonian federalism idea, individuals are the best judges of their own private interest, and self-government is possible. They can figure out what the problems are and work together through cooperative agreements like covenants to resolve those problems. And it was Elinor Ostrom who won a Nobel Prize for her work demonstrating that self-government is actually quite common around the world. For the Wilsonian federalism, it's about positive liberty. The government is actively engaged in protecting people's ability to pursue the life that they want. For the Madisonian federalism, it's largely about negative liberty, the idea that individuals are free to choose how to live their lives and make their choices. The idea of power under the Wilsonian federalism is its centralized hierarchical control. Enlightened leaders and experts decide what the best policies are. And the objective is to protect the rights, prevent harms, minimize competition, and stop conflict. For the Madisonian federalism, power is dispersed, sovereignty is divided. Policy is a result of elections, checks and balances. Competition and conflict are positive forces when they're based on ongoing relationships, and there are institutions that can help to resolve conflict. So it's not preventing conflict and competition, it's just putting them in the institutions that can resolve them. Federalism for Wilsonian federalism is a transitory phase in a nation's evolution to unitary government and national union. Federalism for Madisonian federalism is self-government, diversity. Diversity is recognized to lead to inequality. And e pluribus unum, right? A limited union based on a covenant, but allowing significant diversity within the states beyond that. Now, it's interesting that there's a division over science between these two groups. Wilsonian federalism is based on Newtonian mechanics, right? The purpose is to free humans by understanding and controlling nature. Its assumptions are materialism, physical matter is all that matters. Reductionism, we can reduce everything down to its parts to understand the whole. Linearity, small inputs equals small outputs. And it's predictable. Under Madisonian federalism, the new science that's coming out, systems and complexity theory, argues that humans and human society are dynamic, complex systems. Humans are not billiard balls. The Newtonian mechanics doesn't apply, right? Human systems are not reductive, linear, or precisely predictable. The Wilsonian federalism favors a systemic approach, define everything precisely, focus on behavioral regularities, find the boundaries that cannot be crossed. For complexity systems theory, the regularities that may exist in one situation can shift to new attractors overnight, and oftentimes by small inputs rather than by major inputs. That's a radical change from the Newtonian mechanics theory. Under the Wilsonian federalism, planning is the solution. Society is perfectible, order can be preconceived and imposed top-down, and coordination is required. This removes power from local governments. Under the Madisonian federalism, order can be dynamic, spontaneous, and bottom-up. Expertise is limited. Experts can't predict very well in long-term situations. There are institutional limits, right? For example, information is sticky and local. As Elinor Ostrom said, anytime you involve bureaucracy, it entails a loss of information because the information does not move up into other areas and hierarchies very well. And it creates a democratic paradox. The more you defer to experts, the less opportunity there is for democratic participation. The more likely that people are going to feel alienated, disengaged from their political system. And finally, there's an element of political communication that's significantly different between the two. Wilsonian relies on justification. And on this idea, it's about public reasoning. Hobbes said we need to defer to the elites to decide what's right. Rousseau said that we should defer to the general will, what each would will if each willed what was best, not to individual choice. And Kant described enlightened public reason, giving into reason and science to figure out what's right. Each of them denies individual judgment, individual knowledge and understanding. Now, the leadership is central to managerial decentralization's success. Under Madisonian democracy, federalism, there's deliberative persuasion. Institutions can foster deliberation. Humans have a natural capacity to make sense of complex situations. There's practical judgment. Individuals draw on their own experience and feelings to identify what's good for them and theirs. A detailed set of rules is not necessary. People are able to come together and work together to figure out what's going to happen. It does require institutions that foster deliberation. It does require individuals to have an open mind, to be willing to talk and share and communicate with each other. This isn't manipulation and pandering, but it does require the art of association that Tocqueville talks about, and it's learned by actually participating in these activities. It's not simply alienating your judgment and going along with what the experts say. And interestingly, Elinor Ostrom found that in the success of these spontaneous organizations, leadership is not a key to the success, but it is the engagement between the different groups and the open communication and the rules that they set up. All right, a few conclusions. There are two different interpretations of the Constitution, science, and political communication. And these two very different interpretations frame our political debates today. Those who studied covenants and talked about covenants said that every now and then they need to be renewed and revived. And to a certain extent, that's what we are doing now. We need to go back and find out what are the fundamentals upon which we can agree. We need to have better civic education to understand the American system of government. And we need to have better openness and respect for the different perspectives of these two different opinions and ways of thinking. And I would argue finally that we need to heed Madison's warning that centralization increases executive power, because as more responsibility is handled by the federal government, Congress gets bogged down and can't make those decisions. And so it defers to the executive. And this becomes a problem because enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. Thank you.
Thank you, Troy. your remarks. I look forward to now being able to discuss them. We've covered quite a lot of territory in these three presentations, and the questions that are coming in reflect that. If you bear with me for just a minute as I sort through them. All right, so first question, this is, and again, our questions are quite varied. So this is for Professor Young, and would invite him to respond first, and then our other panelists, should you care to weigh in, we'd welcome that as well. Professor Young, can you comment on how we can create a healthy dialogue on balancing serious risks to health, the economy, social isolation, et cetera, in such an incendiary political climate?
So I think decentralizing the response should help with that. It's interesting that we have a very kind of high stakes political debate going on in the context of the presidential campaign, which assumes that this is a federal responsibility and the president should take the lead. And that means that issue of how to respond to the pandemic is caught up with who you want to be president, who you want to run the rest of the government. And one would have hoped that by decentralizing the question, you could decentralize the debate a little bit, for instance. So we have a gubernatorial election in North Carolina, and many of the same things are at stake, but it's just not being conducted in the same kind of terms, right, as the presidential debate. The stakes are low, I think. And so the debate about how to respond to the pandemic, whether to reopen the bars, whether to reopen the schools, it takes on a much more practical tone, right? Whereas I don't think the debate at the national level has been conducted in terms of practicalities at all. It's been conducted in much more ideological terms about, well, did you really just not care about killing all those people and things? Just these incredibly incendiary charges. And so I think there's some hope that if we came around to an understanding that these sorts of things would have only a limited role for the federal government, that it wouldn't be the whole ball game, that might lower the stakes and therefore the temperature of our national debate. But because you can always federalize things if you want to, I'm not sure that'll work, because the one candidate can always say, well, I would take it over and I would do it better and federalize the debate and put it back in those high stakes terms. I'm not sure that's much of an answer.
Thank you. Other panelists wish to comment on that? All right. I have a question for Professor Gerstle. Do you believe there is a way for the federal government to regain their previous control? And would this be beneficial or detrimental to the US, in your opinion? I think we're muted.
Yeah, I just unmuted myself. Well, I think the questioner is reading my inclinations correctly. I think we need a better central government than the one we've had. And I think the decline of the central government began not with Trump. I think it began in the 1990s with deep polarization. There are big differences among we three panelists. But I think we all see polarization as a very serious problem in American life. And where that polarization is most intensely felt is at the national level and in Congress. And I just don't think America can be a healthy, functioning, well-functioning society unless it has a Congress able to do things. And I think that requires members of Congress to believe that the central government can be put to good use. And I think the federal government, with the vaccine campaign accepted, has not been put to good use during this crisis. And I would say it's not been put to good use during the Trump administration. And I don't know exactly where the Republican Party stands on that. And if Trump loses, whether they will take a somewhat different stance than he has toward the federal state. I think if an effective federal government is to be revived, it's going to have to be done by the Democrats rather than the Republicans. And that's going to require a victory by Biden. It's going to require, I think the Democrats will take the House. It's going to require a victory in the Senate. And it's also going to require something more than what Obama got, which is 2 years to rebuild trust in American government. I do think that what has to be rebuilt as well is the belief that the central government can do good things in American society. And I think there's a big section of American society that does not believe that well. That's not going to be accomplished simply by the Democrats retaking power. It's got to require a different kind of civics education campaign than perhaps the one that Professor Smith had in mind. But I agree with him on the importance of civics education. And that means building confidence that the central government can do things effectively and things of benefit to all of the American people. And I think that begins probably with getting beyond this boundary, this binary between Madisonian and Wilsonian Republican federalism, where all the good federalism is in the Madisonian camp and all the bad federalism is in the Wilsonian camp. I think we somehow have to surmount that. There would still be a capacious role for the states. One can still imagine a healthy, vigorous federalism. And I think this pandemic has, by throwing the initiative back to the states, has demonstrated to various governors and state governments they can take the initiative in interesting ways in national politics. But it has to filter up to the federal level. If we can't solve the problem of polarization at the federal level, then I think this country is going to be in a good deal of trouble.
Thank you. Other panelists, I'm sure, want to weigh in on this.
I actually think there's a lot of agreement between Gary and myself. I agree that the solution, there needs to be a big part of the solution that comes from the national government. I think there is a very vital and important role for the national government. I think federalism, right, we oftentimes it gets the idea that it's about states' rights or it's about local control, and misses that side of it, that it is about union. It is about a national government. There is a responsibility and role for the national government, and if we could call it the covenant, the American covenant, or the foundational agreement that pulls Americans together, is over the national government and what it should do. Now, there's a disagreement over what it should do, but let's not forget that a strong, powerful national government is at the heart of federalism. It's a limited government, but it does have a role and responsibility. Now, where we might disagree is how we get Congress to be more practical and more engaged. I think Madison has a good point that as we centralize power and as the federal government is asked to do more things, it becomes more difficult for Congress to do those things. It only has a limited amount of time. The House has 435 members who are all clamoring to speak, right? The Senate doesn't have time limits on how they speak on most issues. And so there's a limited amount of things that they can do and do well. If they have too many responsibilities, Madison said, then they will defer to the executive. And that's largely what's happened to the extent that we have a very strong executive. I would argue that if the federal government did less, it could do what it does well, and that would increase confidence in the national government and increase public support for Congress and the national government.
Yeah, I don't think any of us disagree that we need a strong national government. We need a well-functioning national government. I think there's two issues. One is, if you're trying to figure out what to do with the governments we have, and not the governments that we want to have. And we have to remember, Madison's point that enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. And I remember waking up the morning after the 2016 election and thinking, well, at least all my colleagues who are usually skeptical of federalism and separation of powers will probably now be a little easier to convince that enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm, right? And so my remarks are directed mostly toward, given that we have a lot of dysfunction at the national level, there are very good reasons to think devolving certain aspects of this response are very plausible responses. But do we need to improve the functioning of the federal government? Of course we do, because the federal government, even under the current policy menu, has incredibly important roles. I suspect that when we look back on this crisis, the things that the federal government hung on to, encouraging vaccine development and fiscal stimulus and relief, that those are going to loom every bit as large as the things that the states were doing. It's just more salient because it's easier to see a lockdown in your neighborhood than it is to see what the feds are doing or not doing for vaccine research. And I'm agnostic on whether the federal government under this administration is doing those things well. I hope they are, but I don't really have much way to tell. It's terribly important that we have a functioning federal government to do that. I do think that reforming the functioning of our politics at the national level is going to require some way to live together and not just count on the good guys winning, right? So I don't think civic education is going to convince 50% of the country that they should be Democrats. And so part of the reason why we are in the fix that we're in, I think, is that a lot of people felt left out of kind of an elite consensus about appropriate policies and things like that. And the backlash finally came. And so I think we need to figure out a way to get both parties to be more functional and both parties to work together better. And I do think that's going to entail taking some of the just intractable controversies over some of the social issues, for instance, off the national menu, devolving them to places where different states can go different ways, and maybe leaving behind things that it's easier for us to agree about, like hopefully pandemic responses.
Any further comment on that question? Okay. I have a question directed to Professor Smith. What could we apply from the Wilsonian federalism and Madisonian federalism in regards to the pandemic?
So I think that with the pandemic, for me, everything is conjecture right now. As Ernest pointed out, there's a lot that we don't know. And, people were championing different nations as successful, having successful policies, Kosovo and Japan. And it's actually turned out that now it's turned around for them, and it's quite bad. Also, New York, United States has one of the worst death rates. That's true, but the state leading that at the current moment, now that might change, but leading it by quite a ways is New York. Now, what's the reason for New York's problems? Is that because there are two different varieties of the virus on the West Coast and the East Coast? There's some indication that maybe the East Coast virus was more deadly. Is it due to more different urban densities, more mass transit, lifestyle choices? Smoking is more common on the East Coast than it is on the West Coast. Is it due to choices of Mayor de Blasio and Governor Cuomo, right? I just think right now that we don't have enough information to make any definitive claims. I would also point out that the CDC has had a number of problems within it, but are those problems in the CDC due to undue influence by the Trump administration? Is it due to what public choice says are inherent problems with bureaucracy? Or is it due to the lack of knowledge that we have scientifically with the virus and how best to deal with the virus? I'm all for having an investigation into these things, but I would say it's not either or Madison or Wilson. I do think that there is a lot to learn about public administration and good bureaucracy and good management and using science to develop the best practices. I do think We give too much credit to science and experts at times. And that's a justification for giving influence and opportunity to people to participate in defining the laws and policies that govern their lives.
Professor Young or Professor Gerstle?
Well, I have to defend New York. They got hit really hard. Cuomo made one big mistake in terms of use of attitude toward nursing homes. But I would say his response after that has been very impressive. And New York has flattened the curve and kept it flat more successfully than most other states in the country. And so I think it's very important to give that credit and to be clear that New York is on the successful side of the divide. And just to illustrate the point of that, Boston, because I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts now, has just closed its public schools again. And New York public schools are being a success. So there's quite impressive success right there. And in terms of invoking the Madisonian or Wilsonian model, I come out here strongly for more Wilsonianism, more expertise, more regard for the CDC. It hurts me to see the decline of the CDC, kind of the gold standard for in the globe for handling disease. And it seems to me it has been politicized, that opposition to science and scientific knowledge has hurt it, demoralized people who work for it. I accept your point, Professor Smith, that there is quite a lot we don't know about the pandemic, and it is confounding everybody everywhere. And I think we would be in better shape if we understood more about this virus that we've never had before. But rendering our most important institution for doing that vulnerable is not the way to do that. And I also think that as difficult as it is to impose uniform standards for a pandemic, more encouragement for from the president to wear masks, I think, of the lives that would have been saved. I think that's rather an uncontroversial statement. It wouldn't even have to be a mandate, or it wouldn't have to be an executive order. It could just be encouragement, and also to stop the talk about Clorox as possibly being a cure. And you think of the damage that this has done. I think of the kind of chief executive that Wilson was during his time, and I sort of wish we had someone like that in the White House right now. I think there'd be a lot fewer deaths if that were the case.
Please don't think that what I'm doing is defending Trump.
I mean, Wilson was blind to the greatest American dilemma of his day, right? And so
which one are you talking about?
I'm talking about race, right? I mean, he was the culmination of reunion and sweeping Reconstruction under the rug, and and he's being canceled now, right? And I don't think he should be, but enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm, and most of them are going to be a mixed bag, as even Wilson, who I would consider one of the great presidents in many ways, was a mixed bag, right? This is why I like, 50 baskets, or in addition to the federal one. I do think, as a matter of, the CDC raises an interesting point, because the question is whether politicization is an entirely bad thing. And I have no doubt that there have been things that none of us would defend, encroaching on the CDC. On the other hand, the idea that what to do about lockdowns, what to do about reopening is a medical scientific decision alone, I just think is fundamentally implausible, because you have to weigh so many different things that are outside the training of CDC scientists. How much economic dislocation are you going to weigh against a certain number of lives? Right? That's a moral decision, it's a political decision. And so the reason that the executive power is vested entirely in the president is that there has to be that kind of political accountability. So there has to be some kind of politicization of the CDC. If it is an expert agency wielding that kind of power with no political check, then not only is it completely unconstitutional, but it's a terrible idea. So I think we need better. I think what we've got right now is a revolt against expertise that is often indiscriminate in its impact. And that we have to be very careful about. We need to respect expertise, but I think we also need to be having a little more of a calm, precise conversation about what expertise gets us and what it doesn't, right? Because it doesn't get us those basic moral and political choices. And then the last thing, one thing you mentioned earlier about being optimistic or pessimistic about the states. My friends always call me Eeyore, so it's always fun to be called an optimist. I may be just being more pessimistic in my expectations, right? My baseline would be something like, pandemics are hard. It's likely to not go well. And it could have gone a lot worse than it's gone. And so I think it would reduce the temperature of the national debate about the pandemic to simply kind of think about that for a moment and think about, all these people are given it their best shot. And it's a very, very hard situation. And we are muddling through. I mean, you as a historian know better than anybody that America doesn't get a brilliant solution to problems on its first cut, almost ever, right? It muddles through. And I think that's what we're doing. And that's what federalism is designed to do.
Well, I don't want to defend Wilson on race. I thought when you said he missed the biggest problem of his day, I thought you were referring to the first pandemic, which he also did not do a good job on. So I will grant you that. And I do agree that the pandemic is a devilish problem. But I think the US has done badly, actually. I think some simple things could have been done to save a lot of lives. And not through executive action, but just executive encouragement and something as simple as wearing of masks. And I also accept your position that scientists don't have all the answers, but there have been times when what seem like commonsensical scientific rules have been flouted and turned into a case of my personal liberty. John Stuart Mill made, one of the great liberal theorists who would have been comfortable with Madison, made the point a long time ago that my liberty is not the liberty to inflict pain and suffering on other people. And I think that version and philosophy of history has gone missing from this political moment.
I'd like to shift focus a little bit here. We have a few questions, a few student questions about federalism scholarship. And so one is I think directed to Professor Young, but certainly open up to all. I'm going to piggyback another question on it. So the question for Professor Young: are our studies of American federalism today missing important acknowledgments of capitalism influences? And then to piggyback on that, what might COVID-19 do for the future of federalism scholarship? So thinking about the future, as this panel looks at the future of federalism, what does the future of federalism scholarship looks like, specifically with respect to capitalism, and then broadly, how might COVID-19 affect the future of the field?
So I think it's going to be good for the field. I'm not sure if it's going to be good for particular federalism scholars, right? And it depends in some ways on how things come out. But we have had a tendency in recent decades to take every major problem and federalize it. And so if you were a federalism scholar pushing back against that, you had the luxury of dealing in hypotheticals, right? So you could say, well, the states would have done this better. Now we're actually going to have a test of the states taking the lead on some really important things. And we're going to see if they would have done it better, right? And who knows? I mean, I just really don't think we know very well about how all that's going to come out. I think we'll muddle through. And maybe that's where the bar should be. But, Could it have been clean? What I think it's going to be important to do, though, is not to compare ideals to actuals, right? So once we figure out what the optimal response to a pandemic is, I think the temptation will be to say, well, we had 33 states that didn't do that, and therefore federalism is a terrible idea. I think, the benefit of hindsight will help us answer the correct question. But the correct question is a federal system more likely to get us to the right answer or to an acceptable answer than a unitary response? And I think, so you can't be all hindsight, if that makes any sense. You can't compare diverse state policies to just a unitary government that adopted the right policy. You also have to ask, how likely, for instance, was it that the unitary government would have adopted that policy? How would things have gone differently? So I'm not quite sure what the questioner means by the capitalism aspect of the question. I would simply say that I think there is a vision of federalism that includes non-governmental bodies as other centers of power. And so I did a 200th anniversary paper on the Dartmouth College case last year. And one thing that the Dartmouth College case essentially did was make private education possible, because it kept the state from taking over Dartmouth and made college charters sacred and that sort of thing. And so what that did was basically contribute to the building of a civil society in which there were multiple kinds of educational institutions generating ideas and contributing to debate and all those sort of things. And so I think one thing we are seeing is that we have a system where there's a lot of power that's dispersed, not only within the government, but outside the government. And that there may be some benefits to that as well.
This moment is great for federalism studies. Look at this conference. Look at the people you've brought together. Look at the size of your audience. And it just, Professor Young said that America has had a tendency to federalize problems. I would say American historians have had a tendency to federalize the government. In other words, all they want to study is the central state, and historians have ignored the states for generations. And I'm one of the first people to insist you cannot study American government without studying the states and the relationship to the federal government. I mean, could you be any more elementary than that? And in that way, I'm definitely a Madisonian. But this has been completely written out of American history, and now it's coming back in a big way. And this is going to trigger a flood of studies among historians about the history of federalism. So in that way, it's a very encouraging sign. I don't know what it's going to yield, but it's going to be exciting. It's going to be dynamic. It's going to be fertile. One comment about capitalism and federalism. I don't know if the student was getting at this, but before World War II, the major reason we got a big state in America is because the individual states could not handle big corporations. Big corporations could move from one state to another. The states tried to regulate them. There's a long history of that, but it's a history of failure. It's an inability to regulate big corporations, then national, now international, on a state-by-state basis. And that was the bigger driver for centralization. And if the student is asking, how are we going to regulate capitalism in a renewed age of federalism, it's an absolutely brilliant question, and we don't know the answer to that. It's not clear that federalism has an answer to that. It may be that, as before, this is where the central government comes back into play. And here, if we're ending soon, here's an optimistic note. Who knew that Attorney General Barr would file an antitrust suit against Google in the waning days of the Trump administration? I'm trying to figure this one out. But part of what's interesting about it is that this is where a certain part of the right of the Republican Party and a certain part of the left of the Democratic Party actually agree. What does Elizabeth Warren most want? She wants to either regulate or break up the big social media companies. And here suddenly, out of nowhere, seemingly, I don't know what the Barr administration or the Trump administration strategy is here. I don't get it. It's not the first time I haven't gotten something about the Trump administration, but it may actually represent an interesting development for a possibility of convergence. I would be interested in hearing from the true Federalist scholars on this panel, my two companions here. I don't consider myself a true Federalist scholar. Is there a solution for regulating corporations and capital at the level of the state? Can you imagine something like that happening? Or does it in fact have to be kicked upstairs to the central government for the reasons I've outlined?
Well, one example is the states taking down big tobacco, right? I mean, that was a suit where the states combined their forces and did it through litigation. But the tobacco settlement, in many ways, looks like a federal statute, and it regulates nationwide. But the combined might of the state attorneys general was sufficient to take down even one of the most powerful cartels in American history. And so I think there's others examples of that sort of litigation, but I think that's probably, that's what I would point to, at least, as a hopeful sign.
I'll just add a little bit quickly on if you look at Elinor Ostrom's book that she won the Nobel Prize particularly for, Governing the Commons, she sets that up by talking about two solutions to the problems that we have. One is government solving the tragedy of the commons problem, and the second is the market, private property. And the point that she's making is there's a third alternative that's oftentimes neglected. And this goes to Ernest's point that there are these civil organizations, groups, nonprofit organizations. There's different ways of people combining collectively to solve problems that aren't necessarily government top-down centralization or the market economy. And these have been neglected, but I think it's a tool that we can foster and develop within the system. And then one final point about the future and what we learned from COVID, I would be careful about applying too many lessons from this. Hopefully we can take lessons and we can improve our institutions and our response, but the next virus is not going to be the same. And let's not fight the last war. We need to have the flexibility open so that we can adjust to what it brings.
Okay. Professor Smith, Professor Young, Professor Gerstle, thank you very much for an incredibly stimulating panel, a fantastic end to this two-day conference. It's been a pleasure to be with you, and I'm so glad that our audience has been able to learn from you this afternoon, or morning as the case may be, still in Hawaii. I invite the three of you to join the breakout room while I offer a few very, very few closing remarks. On behalf of my colleagues here at the Center for Constitutional Studies, I thank all of our speakers and moderators throughout the conference. And we thank you, our viewers, for joining us. We hope you've come away not only better informed, but with a deeper and broader perspective on American federalism. Speaking especially with the students who are watching in mind, I hope you've noted how speakers who have very different, even opposing perspectives were able to disagree with civility. There is much, much to be learned from that. Now, this is the first in a 2-year series of conferences focused on principles of American federalism. Please check back at our website and follow our social media accounts to learn about future events here at the Center for Constitutional Studies. We invite you to join us again and again and again. Until then, it's been a pleasure. Please take care.